Right. So hello everyone and welcome to the 9th annual Accessibility Awareness Days event. I'm Karen Pilon. I'm an Associate University Librarian at the Leddy Library and the moderator for this week's event. So glad you could join us. This is really a great time to be together. So, as I've said before, my name is Karen Pilon and I'm sitting in my office. I have glasses and brown hair. I'm wearing a black dress with some white lines, and my office has a shelf behind it and a brick wall on my right-hand side. And so now I'm going to give a land acknowledgement so that we start off just understanding that the University of Windsor sits on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. And you know, it's really important for us to make this personal, or to at least think about what that really means for us. And because I've told you I work in the library, one of the areas in the library is called the collaboratory. And in the collaboratory, we very intentionally place some indigenous, ways and paths so that people can see themselves as they walk into the space. And one of the areas that's very special that we worked on with Russell Natty was on top of the whiteboard. There's a 2-row wampum there. And I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the 2-row wampum. So again, it's an agreement basically of respect, and sometimes used as a record for treaties and used as gift giving. And it's really important because if you were to look at that, you would see 2 rows, one purple and one white. It's actually supposed to represent some purple beads on a white background. And those 2 lines, those 2 purple lines, refer to 2 boats. They're representing 2 boats, usually a canoe and a European ship. And so it represents the European and the indigenous peoples, where they are both going in the same path. And the idea is that although they are working together and going in the same path, there will always be respect between those 2 nations. So neither group will force traditions or customs on the other, but they will coexist peacefully as each follows their path. And so that's one of the things that are really that speak to me, and that's part of our library. So things to remember. So when you come visit our library and our university, you can see the 2-row wampum on top of our whiteboard and remember that collaboration and respectful spirit of all peoples at the university. And so this is the first of 5 short workshops with the theme Making UWindsor Accessible, and discussing initiatives and services and resources available at the university. Throughout the event, tips will also be shared on what we can do to make the campus more inclusive. So each week, the presenters will share a 20-minute presentation, leaving time for a short question and answer period. So if you would like to ask a question, please type your questions in the Q&A box during the presentation, and we will address them at the end. So if you are on Teams and you can see that there's a little Q&A button with 2 little talk bubbles, one has a question mark on it, and you could put your question there. And you know, the usual chat feature is off, so this is where we want you to type your questions. Also for captioning, please click on the 3 dots in the menu bar, scroll down, and turn on live captions. This panel format provides a quick overview of our topic, and we will send out information with additional resources for those who wish to learn more after the event. This week's panel discussion is on universal design for learning and accommodations, and we have 4 presenters. We have Nick Baker, who is the Director of the Office of Open Learning, who will be presenting on Universal Design for Learning. Hi, Nick. We have Jocelyn Laredo, who is the Advisor from Student Accessibility Services. Hi, Jocelyn. And Sherry Gagnon, Accessibility Manager from the Office of Human Rights and Accessibility, and she will be addressing common myths about academic accommodations. We also have Skyla Baker. who is a University of Windsor student and student rep on the Accessible Information and Communications Committee. So at this time, it gives me great pleasure to turn the presentation over to Nick to start this panel discussion. Go ahead, Nick. I'm going to now turn my camera off and give you the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to have this conversation today as well. And I'll start out with just a little bit about myself as well. I am a fair-skinned cis male with short brown hair. I wear glasses. I am presenting from my office today, my home office. So I'm using a virtual background. The virtual background that I have is of a place that I used to work called Fraser Island in Australia. So it's a vista of a beach behind me at the moment, and I'm wearing a blue Lancers polo top. So I get to kick off this panel, and I guess for me the real superstars of this are coming up next. So I will try not to take up too much of your time. But I wanted to kick us off by talking a little bit about universal design for learning and some work that we've been doing provincially recently on this. So the concept of universal design, if you're not familiar with it, comes out of architecture. In the early 80s, there was a movement towards designing products and spaces that were usable by all people to the greatest possible extent. So it was about removing barriers to access rather than trying to adapt things later on or accommodating for things later on. So a good example of this is if you look at a new building these days, where you once might have seen only stairs, you'll now see all buildings will have ramps. Where you might have seen only heavy doors, you might see those are much wider, and they're usually automatic as well. So those things make the building more accessible for everyone. So the concept of universal design for learning kind of builds upon that, and it's the idea that you can design educational environments, both physical, virtual, and cognitive, that remove the barriers for a large portion of the population, because we know that for many people there are lots of invisible barriers to them being successful in education. And in fact, we've seen over the last couple of years with the work that's happened during the pandemic that many of those barriers that existed before, especially in higher education, have been broken down by some of the pedagogical changes that we've made, some of the policy changes that we've made, and some of the physical changes that we've had to make in teaching from home. So universal design is built on the principles, built on neuroscience, if you like, cognitive neuroscience, and it addresses some of the pathways in the brain. I have an image on screen at the moment. It's a sectioned brain with a green pathway through it that represents the affective pathway, neural networks inside the brain, if you like. So when you're designing using universal design principles, they address the affective, so that's the kind of the why are we learning this stuff, the recognition pathway, which is about the what of the learning, and then strategic, which is about how we learn. If you fast forward to the 90s, the Center for Applied Special Technology, CAST, started doing a whole lot of work around developing these principles of universal design. And there are three core principle sets to that. Multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. So when you're designing learning environments and activities, keeping those things in mind will reduce many of the barriers that exist for most people. What you're not trying to do in an accessible, in a universal design, is to accommodate individuals. What you're trying to do is design an environment that removes the majority of barriers for all. And you know that you are never going to be able to accommodate every single person. But what you're trying to design are recognition of the diversity in the learner population. So you're recognizing that that diversity exists, and instead of ignoring it or trying to build a one-size-fits-all approach, you allow that diversity to drive the way that you design and the activities that you do. I have some examples, and Karen mentioned that we'll be sharing some additional resources. So there's a plain text version of what I have on screen at the moment. And this, the imagery that I'm showing at the moment is a hierarchical list of activities that you may consider underneath those 3 pillars of UDL. Multiple means of engagement might be things like providing exemplars to students so that they have a clear understanding of what it is that you're looking for, providing note-taking support, opportunities to celebrate different ways of learning, opportunities to celebrate and reflect upon what's been learned in a course. Multiple means of representation we can probably imagine. Those are things like using different formats, multiple formats for the same kind of information, using interactive learning activities, incorporating multimedia resources, linking to different information, for example, that helps students build upon the knowledge that they already have. And then multiple means and actions of expression, developing a plan and sticking to it, opportunities to practice skills, providing options for the way in which students communicate with you, their learning, and choice in assessment. So the main thing I wanted to talk about today really quickly is this work that we've been doing at the provincial level that was funded last year by eCampus Ontario. And it's a project called Universal Design for Learning for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility. Essentially what we were doing was pulling together a whole lot of resources that have already been built across the province and filling in the gaps between those to provide something that supports UDL across the sector. And our original idea was to focus on the new requirements for the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, where we would need to have some training in place to be compliant with that. But really what we felt was most important was to look at that through the lens of universal design. So rather than trying to focus on just the accessibility component, focusing on universal design practices means that we can get at a whole lot of other challenges that we face in higher education already. So as of midnight last night, this project was finished, or at least first draft of it was finished, and we have an open textbook, an open resource that's available. And what it will do is form the basis of a micro-credential. It was a huge amount of work with 10 universities and 30 odd people involved in the project, and wonderful partners across the province. My project co-lead from Mohawk College, who have already developed a ton of resources if you want to see UDL work, did a power of work in pulling this together. So our approach was to think of universal design, as I said, not just from an accessibility point of view, and the diagram that I'm showing on screen has universal design in the center, surrounded by the concepts of diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. And what that allows us to do is to also get at some difficult concepts like decolonizing pedagogies and anti-racist pedagogies, which are naturally fit with UDL. So I'm showing on screen an image of the finished press book, if you like, the open textbook that's there. And our aim was to have this course available to everyone across the province, anyone who wants to take it. There are 6 modules that you can complete. You can work your way through at your own pace. What we're hoping to build here is a micro-credential that would allow you to take each of those modules. For example, maybe earn a digital badge at the end of each module, put those together into some kind of micro-certification in universal design for learning with a focus on inclusivity, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And one of the things that I'll also point to that's different in this resource is that we did commit to including and exploring the idea of the relationship between Indigenous pedagogies and universal design for learning. So we've started to do that in this. There's a lot more work to do, but our very own Jamie Kachego here at Windsor and Laurie Stolichuk wrote that chapter and designed it from a wonderful Indigenous perspective and using storytelling principles. So the next steps are we'll stand up this micro-credential sometime later in the year. It will be open to everyone and we'll be communicating a lot more about that. But the resource is available now and we have to acknowledge the funding and the support from eCampus Ontario and the Ontario government to build this. So I will leave it there and hand over to my wonderful colleagues.
Thanks, Nick. So we're going to just jump into some quick introductions, and then we'll just dive into the next part of the presentation. So I'm Sherry. I'm sitting in my office at the University of Windsor. I have long brown hair, light skin, and I am wearing yellow and blue. Jocelyn?
Yeah, so I'm Jocelyn Laredo. I also am sitting in my office at the University of Windsor. I have light brown hair, I'm wearing glasses, and I too am in yellow and blue.
Hi, my name is Skyla. I am a current undergrad student in Arts and Humanities at the university. I have long blonde hair, and I am currently in a black t-shirt.
Okay, so what we're going to talk about in this part of the presentation is some common myths around accommodation in post-secondary. So by implementing universal design for learning practices, it may assist with reaching a broader base of students and therefore reduce some of the planning for individual accommodations. However, each person is unique, and despite the best UDL planning, individual accommodations still may need to be implemented. So we're just going to hit some of the common myths around accommodations in post-secondary. So our first myth 1, my high school said that universities don't give accommodations to students with disabilities. So universities aren't covered through the Education Act that governs K-12 in Ontario. However, accommodations based on protected grounds such as disability are required under the Human Rights Code and the OHRC policy on accessible education for students with disabilities. In addition, the AODA, or the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act, has accessible requirements that universities must meet.
So Jocelyn, students are accommodated in university, but often not in the same way as they were in high school. We work with students to find out what their needs are and support them to ensure equal access. We do not modify requirements, which means all students must be able to achieve the bona fide academic requirements for the course.
Myth number 2, if I get an accommodation plan, my professors will know my diagnosis.
So Jocelyn again, it is the responsibility of Student Accessibility Services to collect relevant medical information to develop an accommodation plan. The advisor then sends out the letter to the faculty, but nowhere do we disclose a diagnosis. Some students do choose to tell their instructors about their disability, but they do not have to. We do encourage all students registered with SAS to have a conversation about their accommodation needs with their instructor.
Okay, myth number 3, student accommodations are solely the responsibility of Student Accessibility Services. So under the Ontario Human Rights Codes, institutions have a duty to accommodate to the point of undue hardship, meaning excessive costs or significant health and safety risks. And so the bar or threshold is very, very high. There's a procedural duty to accommodate, which is how the university assesses an accommodation, which is primarily the responsibility of Student Accessibility Services. Then there is the substantive duty to accommodate, which is the implementation of the accommodations. And this is where administration and instructors have a role. Then finally, the institution, meaning the administration and faculty, should be taking requests for accommodation in good faith. Students also have a responsibility by participating in the process and by making their needs known. And at the university, Student Accessibility Services offices are the portal where that process begins.
So Jocelyn, as we as advisors work with the student to create an academic accommodation plan. For face-to-face classes, we will invigilate exams in our office. However, it is the student's responsibility to schedule the exam with our office. Students who are online or hybrid will need the instructor to implement their accommodations for exams through Blackboard. Open Learning is a great place for your assistance if you're having challenges implementing accommodations through your Blackboard. For classroom accommodations, it is encouraged that you and the student have conversations around what their specific needs are.
4, students registered with accessibility services have it easier than other students or get an advantage by registering.
So universal design for learning and academic accommodations acknowledge that diversity is the expectation and not the exception. Just like most spheres in society, services and physical spaces have been designed for the mythical average person to access. UDL and AA helps us to adapt our environment to make things as accessible as possible for as many people as possible who wish to access our services. In this case, education. It is about creating equitable environments that allow for everyone to enjoy the benefits of an education. Students who register with SAS must still meet the academic requirements of the course. Our students are bright, work extremely hard, and are resilient.
Myth 5, this student looks fine to me. How can I trust that they actually have a disability? So 1 in 5 Canadians identify as having a disability, and for youth between the ages of 15 and 24 who have a disability, 60% have a mental health disability, which may not be apparent or visible. But there are all sorts of other types of disabilities that may not be apparent. Crohn's and colitis, multiple sclerosis with periods of relapse and remission, long-term cancers, brain injuries, diabetes, and neurodiversity are just a few examples.
Students are required to submit medical documentation to our office, with the doctor giving insight into accommodations a student might need. Students are not accommodated without the proper medical documentation on file in our office. For examples of the medical documentation that we require, you can see it all on our student accessibility website under student documentation.
Okay, myth number 6. Why are advisors? Oh, I'm sorry, Skyla, you had something to say on this one.
That's okay. I was just going to say, like, one thing I would say is, how do we determine the capabilities of other people? And the answer to that would be, we can't. Having the advisors in this place as the bridge of communication between students and faculty allows for a little more comfort between both student and faculty alike. Personal information and health history can be difficult to hear and difficult to share over and over again. So although it is up to the student to bring these things up in the first place, the support and structure that's built around these accommodations is there to help and not hinder.
Thank you. Myth number 6, why are advisors reaching out to instructors when students should be advocating for themselves?
So in some cases, SAS is contacted by students who are unable due to their circumstance. For example, they are in the hospital or are experiencing a flare-up to connect with their instructor. So the advisor will reach out on their behalf. In other cases, the student has said that they have tried to connect, but they are unable to get what they were requesting, and so an advisor will step in to advocate on behalf of the student. However, where possible, the student is encouraged to speak with the instructor to advocate for themselves.
For the sake of time, we did have one more myth, but we're going to skip that one. It is talking about the secure process that Student Accessibility Services has implemented if exams need to be overseen by that department. So we'll skip that for now. And Jocelyn's just going to touch on the new system versus the old system for information sharing.
Absolutely. So Student Accessibility Services has been able to get a new system to help students and faculty navigate accommodations. This new system comes with some changes, but it is here to make lives better when trying our best to support students' academic needs. Some of the language has changed, but essentially the process is the same and requires way less work from our faculty. This system makes it so that you have all the information you need right at your fingertips and easily accessible. Alternative testing agreements are the equivalent to exam cover sheets. Unlike completing a cover sheet for each student, instructors now only need to provide the information once for the course. Our system will populate individual cover sheets for each exam based on the information that is provided. The faculty portal is open 24/7 for instructors to view all students who have requested classroom and exam accommodations, and exams can be uploaded to our secure system and printed by our exam staff, eliminating the need to come into our office and drop them off in person. However, exams still will need to be picked up in person. If you have more questions about our new system, please don't hesitate to contact me.
And now this gives me great pleasure to turn it over to Skyla, who's going to give us some tips from a student perspective.
Yeah, so I know we are pressed on time, so I'll keep it a little short. So I would say, like, educators and students alike could use these resources. So many of the things that are offered here are not traditionally offered in an academic setting, but I would encourage people to look into students offering support. So that's a student-run program that offers exam aid. The Peer Support Center is like student-run counseling. There are many campus supports, so if you have time to look through all of them, there's like an 8 category drop-down menu, so I really encourage you to look through that. It is a phenomenal service run by Student Academic Services, and basically it just helps with like academic approaches that aren't always, you know, the stereotypical ones. And then also check out the mental wellness page that the university does have. It has external sources that may be beneficial to students as well. And then my advice in general for students would be like, and I mean, like, I know there's a lot of instructors here too, so I think this is important to hear, but like, advocate for yourself. No one else is inside your brain, and being able to reach out when you need the help is a really big process. Ask any and all questions. It's important to expand learning, and this is how. I would say ask for help. Professors often share their office hours are quiet. They don't really like have many students drop in, and these hours are there for a reason. So go in, talk to the professors, explain to your students that you're here to help. Find a study buddy. If you can find someone with the similar working style, it's a good process. And then use the campus resources that are available, because there are so many, and I really encourage everybody to look into them. And then talk to another student or friend. There's a lot of people here at the university, and you know, they could end up being a friend for the next 4 years.
Thanks, Skyla, so much for sharing those tips. There's a lot of information that we presented, and we will be sending out a resource sheet after the event to all the attendees with some additional information, and also resources where you know, all the services that Skyla has discussed will be in that document as well. So Karen, I'm going to turn it back over to you if there are any questions. We only have a couple minutes, but.
Sure. Thank you so much to all the presenters. That was really great. I'd like to open the floor. I don't see any questions in the chat right now, but as maybe someone is typing or has a question. Oh, looks like we have a question here. Nope, not yet. Just Sherry's telling us that next week's theme is technology tools. And so, oh, I see a question from Jacqueline Brathwaite. Jacqueline, go ahead.
I think they're going to have to type it.
Oh, okay. They cannot speak it even.
And there was, I think there was one question in the Q&A, Karen, about hostile architecture from Robeck.
All right.
Okay, I did turn the microphones on so we can ask, Jackie can ask her question.
Okay, and after Jackie, we'll take Rob's question. Go ahead, Jackie. Okay, we can't hear Jackie at this time. So we will go to Rob and then we'll go back to Jackie.
Okay,
so
got it fixed.
Rob, oh, that's okay. So Rob's question is, how does universal design architecture interact with hostile architecture that is designed specifically to exclude? Is there a conversation, or does it just come down to the law?
Well, those are really good questions, Rob. And that's what the AODA, you know, does cover some things. The Ontario Building Code does cover others, but a lot of organizations try to exceed the legislative requirements. And I totally agree that there is this design to exclude, and sometimes consciously, sometimes subconsciously. But with the AODA going under review, there is a chance for public feedback. But then again, you know, for organizations like the University of Windsor, we have the Accessible Built Environment Committee, where we have expertise and people who want to push beyond what are the legislative requirements. So any new build or any renovations should be run through the ABAC committee, the Accessible Built Environment Committee, and contact Aria if you'd like to know more or be part of that committee, because we will be happy to take more volunteers. But so those are things that organizations are voluntarily doing to go over and above.
Can I respond to that really quickly too, Sherry?
Yeah.
I would also say that there's it's a really good point in that that hostile architecture extends beyond the kind of you know, sharp spikes and things that we see put on window ledges to prevent people from sitting on them and so on, into in non-intentional hostile designs for things like classrooms that exclude many learners, and also into the digital space as well. Most of our digital resources are built specifically to encourage a certain type of behavior, and that excludes lots of people, regardless of whether it was intended to. So those are really difficult conversations to have with vendors and builders to understand how to avoid that.
Thank you so much. Jacqueline, we're ready for you now.
Thank you. I just had a question about the presentation that Nick, you had a photo of a chair, and I didn't see the link between that slide and universal design. So if you could just elaborate a little bit on that so I can understand it.
Absolutely. I saw my clock running out and jumped past that. So thank you for bringing me back to that. The chair that Jacqueline's talking about is a bench that would normally be comfortable, but it had a barrier placed in front of it. And the barrier is movable. So you could choose to move the barrier that would open up that space for everyone to be able to use it. But if you also looked to the sides of that chair, it was built inside a concrete barrier that made it difficult to stand beside it or get close to it. So it was an example of design that there were some simple things that you could do to make it more accessible and to make it more universally usable, but it was also constrained considerably by the things that were around it.
Can I just ask one more question? If I may. So you were talking about some of the things that are like our technology is only for people who, let's say, can easily see or type or stuff like that. Were there any other things that you were referring to? If you could elaborate a little bit, Nick, on that.
Yeah, so there's lots and lots of things. Examples are some of the designs of technologies for things like learning management systems, for example, can be very easily unintentionally overwhelming for learners. So you can create cognitive overload where you don't intend to. There are things like, most of those systems don't prevent you from creating color issues when you might want to upload something that's beautiful and colorful, but they don't indicate to you most of the time that what you're doing is going to be inaccessible to certain groups of students. But they're getting better at that. Most of the newer ones are starting to build that approach into it. So you at least have some warning of things that you wouldn't be expected to know from a design perspective that's a challenge. But other things that we see that are difficult from a teaching and learning perspective are where you have only one way for a student to demonstrate their learning, for example, demonstrate what they know and how they are able to present to you. So even down to communication, the way in which they communicate it to you, allowing flexibility in that. And that's what we've seen over the last couple of years. People have been much more flexible and much more compassionate and humane and human around the way that they acknowledge learning and acknowledge the outcomes of learning. Those are things that I think I'd love to see stick around. Those temporary policies, there are temporary changes to policies that we've made that actually make life better for everyone. And I think we have to have a really important conversation about what we want to keep and not go back to.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for everyone's questions and the presenters. That's all the time we have for today. I want to thank each and every presenter here and to remind all of those on this call to please join us again for next week's talk on technology tools on March 8th at 11:30. And please don't forget to register. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.